The Vatican canonizes people for money. It is responsible for the collapse of Yugoslavia, and it rules the world through its secret archives, with popes hoarding treasures and the true history of the world. These are roughly the kinds of comments I regularly find under my videos. At first, I found it amusing, but the deeper you dive into the topic, the more you realize it's much more serious. The Vatican has become a new trend for conspiracy theorists, replacing the idea of a world government with a hellish entity that seeks to destroy traditional values and enslave the entire world. And you know what's the scariest part? In some ways, the conspiracy theorists are right, but they're looking in the wrong direction. The Holy See is not nearly as holy as it wants to appear. Clergymen really don't like to advertise facts that, even without crazy talk about reptilians, are chilling enough. Over time, 266 official popes have sat on the papal throne, not counting self-proclaimed usurpers. Among them were both true saints and terrible sinners wielding power and absolute authority. I'll disappoint conspiracy theory enthusiasts right away. We'll steer clear of conspiracies. Everything we'll talk about today is the official history of the Holy See, no conspiracy theories, only verified facts. Just to be clear, not all Roman popes were terrible sinners, but by cruel irony, many of them became the embodiment of all the deadly sins. I'll tell you about 5 main ones: envy, lust, greed, pride, and wrath. An important note, this video will include simplifications to help us navigate the tangled drama of church history. But if you know that the Bishop of Rome, Vicar of Christ, successor of the Prince of the Apostles, Pontiff, Primate of Italy, Archbishop, Metropolitan, and Servant of the Servants is all the same person, don't rush to switch away. This is LITVINUS, and you're on a channel where interesting stories aren't just told, they're explained. Who are the Roman popes? In broad strokes, it's more or less clear, but how did they come about, and why were they needed in the first place? To figure this out, let's travel back in time, straight to the 1st century CE. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verse 18, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Those unfamiliar might think, well, Apostle Peter, the foundation of the church was laid. But in reality, this single line caused the Christian world to cease being united. Catholics and Orthodox don't get along not just because one group crosses themselves from left to right and the other from right to left. The more important issue is power. Catholics believe that Apostle Peter and his successors are the unquestionable leaders of the Christian world, with no one equal to them. Orthodox Christians, however, believe that Roman bishops can indeed be leaders, but only as first among equals. Power over the entire Christian world can only be collective, through a council of all the major hierarchs. This very line solidified the schism we've lived with for 1,000 years. But in the early centuries of the Common Era, this issue was largely insignificant. Christianity was in opposition to the official Roman religion and authorities. Christians were executed and killed, and believers hid in catacombs. The same was true in Rome. From there, the first Roman bishops managed their small flocks. They weren't yet called popes, but formally, they were the leading figures in Christianity. Going underground didn't help. Almost all of them died for their faith. Everything changed during the reign of Constantine the Great in the 4th century. By that time, Christianity had become mainstream in Europe. Constantine allowed the practice of Christianity throughout the empire. In 325, he even presided over the Council of Nicaea, the main gathering of all church bishops, who established the canons and rules of the religion. The Roman bishop was absent from the council. The event took place in Nicaea, near Constantinople, not Rome. In the 4th century, the empire's center of power was shifting eastward, and Rome was in decline. After the Council of Nicaea, Rome lost not only its status as the empire center, but also failed to secure religious supremacy. We'll return to this topic later. In 476, the western part of the Roman Empire finally fell. while the other major church centers, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, remained under imperial control. Rome was captured by barbarians, specifically the Germanic tribe of Ostrogoths. Initially, this was even better for the bishops. Ostrogothic kings didn't interfere in the appointment of Roman bishops, unlike Roman emperors, and things became a bit freer. But this freedom didn't last long. In 537, the Romans Byzantines, that is, the heirs of the Eastern Roman Empire, returned, reclaiming Africa, Italy, and southern Spain. It seemed the empire had returned after a brief period of lawlessness. Byzantium once again took over the appointment of Roman bishops, who by then were already called popes. However, Byzantine power was not as strong as Rome's had once been, and in the context of weak Byzantine governors, popes began to regain strength, not just spiritual, but also secular. The first significant Roman pope in our story is Gregory I the Great. This video will mention many names of popes and secular rulers, so I hope you don't get confused. Gregory took advantage of Byzantium's wars with yet another group of barbarians and essentially seized power over all of Rome. This was unprecedented. Previously, bishops could only lead within the walls of a church, but now they had de facto control over the city and its surroundings. Let's move to the 7th century and look at a map of the Mediterranean. In the east, Byzantium lost control over 3 of the 4 Christian centers. Muslims ruled in Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch. Everything rested on the figure of the Patriarch of Constantinople. One thing is certain, Byzantine power had weakened. In Italy, former barbarians, the Lombards, were in charge. They managed to push the Byzantines to the southern part of the peninsula. Popes were in constant conflict with these new conquerors, and help from Constantinople was no longer forthcoming. Around this time, the method for electing a new pope was finalized through a vote by the clergy. I'll explain the procedure later. Finally, on the territory of modern-day France, a force began to emerge that would change the old order. Power over the Frankish kingdom was seized by Pepin II. The Roman pope at the time, Stephen II, decided not to wait for better days and, for the first time in history, used his status on a geopolitical scale. He traveled to the Frankish kingdom and crowned Pepin. Though Pepin was a usurper, the presence of such an important bishop significantly boosted his legitimacy. The Pope didn't do this for nothing. In return, the Franks entered Italy, defeated the Lombards, and gave part of their lands to the Roman Pope. After this, the Roman Pope definitively became a secular ruler and gained independence from the Byzantines. The Papal States were born, lasting until their incorporation into Italy in the 19th century. Formally, the modern Vatican is a direct successor to the Papal States, but we'll rarely use the modern name of the city-state in this video to maintain historical accuracy. One final touch: Pepin's son, Charlemagne, was crowned emperor by the Pope. This event divided the Middle Ages into before and after. For centuries, there could only be one unique Roman emperor. No barbarian dared claim this sacred right, and now one of them declared himself not just anyone, but the new emperor of the West, the same West that had perished in the 5th century. Now, the political power of the already weak Constantinople was equated with the power of a monarch in the West, and this monarch needed an equal bishop. Around this time, the popes discovered a supposedly secret, long-lost document called the Donation of Constantine. Allegedly, 400 years earlier, it was written by Constantine the Great from the time of the Council of Nicaea. What was the essence of this conveniently timed document? Constantine granted the Roman bishop the right to supreme spiritual authority over all Christians. Additionally, popes gained the right to all secular power. In Constantine's case, the popes temporarily relinquished this power, but retained the right to it. Constantinople, the formal heir of the fallen West, was not consulted. Essentially, this was a massive power grab across medieval Europe. I think many of you have guessed that the Donation of Constantine was a forgery designed to bolster political legitimacy. The popes invented it to strengthen their influence over the church and secular power. For centuries, popes claimed they had the legal right to be the most powerful figures on the continent. It wasn't until the 19th century that it was acknowledged as a fake. So, if you're still confused, here's a brief summary. Over 8 centuries, Christianity went from an underground religion to a key political force in Europe. The so-called two swords theory emerged. There is the sword of spiritual power and the sword of secular power. The first is firmly in the hands of the Roman Pope, while the second is a big question mark. Either the sword is entirely with kings, or, according to the donation of Constantine, secular power also belongs to the Church, which merely delegates it to kings. Let's make a note here. What's more important is that Roman popes gained power that their Eastern counterparts in Byzantium never had. While Byzantine emperors were stronger than their patriarchs, in the West, the Pope was often dependent on secular authorities, but still remained sovereign. With the advent of secular power, the focus of the papacy shifted. Instead of piety and holiness, it became about money and power. Popes began their descent into an abyss, at the bottom of which the word sin was laid out in sharp stones. It's the late 9th century. By this point, the unified Frankish Empire had split into 3 parts: Western, Eastern, and Italian. The title of emperor lost its significance. The Carolingians, descendants of Charlemagne, remained in power only in the East, while Italy was ruled by the Guido dynasty. A conflict inevitably arose. Who exactly would become emperor and unite the fragments of the former empire? The Roman Pope and his coronation were indispensable. Here, we need to dive deeper into how elections to the papal throne work. Today, they are conducted through a so-called conclave, a gathering of cardinals convened after the death or resignation of a pope. If a candidate secures 2/3 of the votes, white smoke rises from the chimney. If not, the smoke is black and the election continues. But in the 9th century, the system worked differently. Democracy, meaning the approval of the pope by the people of Rome, was abolished, but the votes of aristocrats still mattered. Thus, in addition to the clergy, representatives of patrician families directly participated in this election. As a result, papal elections turned into a real battle for power, complete with bribes and hatred between factions. This is exactly what happened in 891 over the issue of succession between the Carolingians and the Guidos. The leader of the first faction was Bishop Formosus, while Stephen, who himself was a member of the Guido family, represented the second. After a very contentious vote, Formosus, backed by the Carolingians, won the papal throne. He crowned the ruler of East Francia, the Carolingian Arnulf, as emperor, essentially sparking an invasion of Italy. But things didn't go as planned. Arnulf died after an illness, leaving Formosus in a very precarious position. He had no strong allies left, and the Guido family, thirsting for revenge, was at his back. A few years later, Formosus also died under highly suspicious circumstances. Now it was Stephen's turn. He killed the next pope and, after elections, took the papal throne himself. An important detail: he didn't just want what was best for his family, he craved power. When Formosus was in power, Stephen was consumed with envy and dreamed of revenge. Even after becoming pope, Stephen VI didn't let go of his hatred. And now, my friends, we enter a plot straight out of Game of Thrones, with the only difference being that this really happened, not in a TV show. The new pope ordered Formosus's corpse to be exhumed, dressed it in papal vestments, and put it on trial. Formosus's election was declared illegitimate, and he was branded a traitor. Since the corpse couldn't speak, a deacon was appointed to speak on its behalf. He stood behind the chair holding the half-decomposed, rotting body, answered questions, and admitted the Pope's guilt. The trial went smoothly. Formosus was found guilty, and his actions as Pope were declared invalid. Stephen personally cursed his old enemy and ordered 3 fingers, the ones used for the sign of the cross, to be cut off the corpse. But the desecration of Formosus's body didn't end there. Stephen ordered the corpse stripped naked, tied to horses, and dragged through the streets of Rome. And so it was done. The body of the former pope was dragged through the Eternal City. After this ritual of humiliation, The corpse was simply thrown into the Tiber, where it was torn apart by the current. It seemed Stephen had demonstrated his power. He, and he alone, could be the Roman Pope. But for some reason, the common people didn't appreciate the spectacle. Then miracles began to occur. The remains of poor Formosus, found by people, were said to heal all diseases. This was a massive problem for Stephen, not the miracle itself, but the people's belief in it. It now appeared that he hadn't just killed his enemy out of envy, but had tortured a saint. Another sign from above was an earthquake that partially destroyed the church where the cadaver synod, as the trial of the dead Formosus was called, took place. It was clear to the public whose side God was on. The Roman people rose up against Stephen. They stormed the papal palace, killed his supporters, and imprisoned him. Soon after, he was simply strangled in prison. But the saga didn't end there. The next 3 popes launched a campaign to rehabilitate Formosus. Whatever remained of him was reburied with honors, and the decisions of the cadaver synod were declared invalid. However, these 3 popes ruled for a total of just 3 years. The struggle for power continued without breaks for lunch or holidays. The Church's final stance was that Stephen VI, the tormentor, was technically right, but the cadaver synod was deemed excessive, and such practices were banned for the future. Formosus's remains were left in the Vatican. The cadaver synod became a point of no return. Roman popes were no longer just quietly poisoning and killing each other. They could do truly horrific things, all driven by envy and a thirst for power. It seemed like a wake-up call to address their mistakes and restore the Church's moral standing. But the next 100 years would be marked by relentless chaos and sin. The era of Pornocracy had begun. To better understand what comes next, let's step back. I don't think it'll surprise anyone to hear that the Middle Ages weren't exactly a time for gender equality. Christianity seamlessly adapted to the traditions of the surrounding world, relegating women to secondary roles in society. In the first epistle to Timothy, attributed to the Apostle Paul, it stated plainly, "Women should remain silent, wear modest clothing, learn quietly, and not dare to have authority over a man." Why? First, because Adam was created before Eve, and second, because Eve tempted Adam into sin, not the other way around. Here's an interesting thing about this epistle. Paul was a contemporary of Jesus, but today, almost all biblical scholars agree that the passage about women was added in the 2nd century. In other words, it wasn't originally part of Christian doctrine, but it needed to be included. How else could you live in a world without a clear hierarchy between men and women? That said, women weren't entirely disrespected in those times. After all, without the Mother of God, or Madonna, there would be no Jesus. But women were still seen as either a complement to men or a more sinful version of them. But what if I told you there was a period when a woman might have sat on the papal throne? In the 9th century, a girl was born into the family of an English missionary. From childhood, she showed an extraordinary thirst for knowledge. At 12, she ran away from home and ended up in Greece. And here begins a story like something out of Disney's Mulan. To hide her gender, the girl dressed in monastic robes moved to Rome and infiltrated the circles of the clergy. With her knowledge, she managed to rise to the highest ranks of the church hierarchy. In the 850s, she became the Roman Pope under the name John. Her reign ended like a punchline. During a procession on horseback, she fell to the ground and went into labor. The papal vestments had cleverly concealed her pregnancy, and when the Roman crowd saw their pope giving birth, they immediately beat her and the child to death. How could such a thing even be allowed? Here's the deal. Though this story is over 1,000 years old, modern scholars consider it a fake. During the years when Joanna was supposed to have ruled, there was another pontiff. Most likely, there was never any John, or rather Joanna. What matters is whether people believed it or not. And for the people of that time, the story didn't seem strange. It wasn't spread by enemies of the Catholic Church, but by its official chroniclers. By the 15th century, this story was referenced by Jan Hus, a precursor to Martin Luther in the Reformation. His main argument: the Church is sinful and corrupt. And when he told the story of the pregnant pope at a council, none of the official church representatives thought to correct him. Even in the 15th century, the church itself was convinced it had such a sin in its past. Just in case, they even invented a special papal coronation chair with a hole in the bottom. Several sources claim that, up until the 15th century, every new Roman pope had to sit on it so a deacon could check the gender of the new vicar of God on earth. If everything was in order, he would loudly proclaim, "Our pope is a man," presumably to avoid another embarrassment, though this might not have helped. 5 centuries before Jan Hus's claims, women undeniably came to power in Rome, and they weren't as educated or noble as Joanna. Let's go back to the crisis-ridden 10th century, when, after the Cadaver Synod, popes were replaced at an alarming rate. The main players in this ecclesiastical game of thrones were Rome's aristocratic families. Let's take a closer look at them. The most prominent family was the Theophylact family. On their own, they weren't particularly remarkable. The Theophylacts weren't dukes of Italy, let alone kings, just a minor comital family. The family's founder, Theophylact, had a decent career, but the family's rise to prominence was driven not by him, but by his wife and daughter. Let's start with the mother. Theodora was hardly the image of an honorable lady. She had numerous lovers, through whom she advanced herself and pulled her husband along. One of her lovers was the Roman Pope, Sergius III. And here's where things get interesting. She made her 15-year-old daughter, Marozia, the concubine of the 45-year-old Pope. Today, this would be called sexual slavery. Do I need to mention that, in Catholicism, priests aren't supposed to have wives or concubines at all? Well, nobody cared. Marozia soon adopted her mother's role model and, through her romantic liaisons, created an entire lineage of relatives on the papal throne. For the next 50 years, the supreme pontiffs would be people connected to the Theophylacts. But we haven't gotten to the juiciest part yet. Sometime later, John XI ascended to the throne. He wasn't just another of Marozia's appointees. His father, with a high degree of certainty, was Pope Sergius III, the same one to whom young Marozia had been given as a concubine. By this time, the boy had grown up, and his mother had secured him a very good position. He became the Roman Pope at 21. If anyone has seen the series The Young Pope with Jude Law, the young Pope there was 47, which is considered practically childish for that position. Let's move on. We're interested in Pope John XII. He was Marozia's grandson and Theodora's great-grandson. He came to power at 18. He held the papal throne for a shockingly long time for that era, almost 9 years. During this time, he managed to leave quite a mark. Let's think about it. What does an 18-year-old with immense power from a family with such a history want? Pleasure. Sins like ordaining deacons in a stable or invoking the names of Jupiter, Venus, and other evil spirits while gambling pale in comparison to his main sin lust. According to contemporaries, John turned the papal palace into a brothel. Debauchery was the main theme of his reign, and he wasn't shy about outright incest. Once, he took his own niece to bed. If you thought such a pope was overthrown for his debauchery, you're wrong. He died for other reasons. One day, he visited a wealthy woman, and there are 2 versions of what happened next. According to one, the 27-year-old suffered a stroke, not very believable. According to the other, the woman's husband returned and, disregarding the pope's status, simply killed him. Thus ended the era officially known as the Pornocracy, literally, the rule of prostitutes. One family, through debauchery and lust, managed to subjugate not just Rome, but the entire Western Christian Church. Over 50 years, 12 different popes came and went. Today, even the most loyal historians cannot deny this period in the history of the papacy. It's considered the darkest in the Church's history. Yet optimists draw a conclusion. If the Pornocracy didn't destroy the Church, what could possibly threaten it? The Pornocracy led to the papacy temporarily losing its influence. Power was taken over by German emperors, who no longer allowed such egregious moral decline among God's vicars on earth. For a while in the 10th century, things got even wilder. Europe was emerging from the early Middle Ages. On the fragments of Charlemagne's empire, something familiar to us began to take shape: France. Though it was in a state of feudal fragmentation, it retained the name we know today. In England, the era of constant Scandinavian invasions was ending. They finally settled down and adopted Christianity. In 1066, William the Conqueror brought the French language and culture to the islands. In Spain, the Reconquista, the reclamation of lands from Muslims, was underway, though it would take another 4 centuries to complete. Central Europe was dominated by a true colossus, the Holy Roman Empire. Its emperors played the leading role in Europe and exerted significant pressure on the Holy See. The conflict between them and the popes would be the main theme of the next few centuries. Finally, the Byzantine Empire in the east managed to strengthen itself and build a solid defense against Arab invasions, though it would soon face a wave of Turkic nomads that would effectively destroy it. But before that, it called on its Christian brothers in the west for help. Pope Urban II promised forgiveness of sins to those who fought against Muslims, launching the First Crusade. All these factors led to Europe beginning to prosper. Poverty and instability gave way to gradual progress and growth. This affected the church as well. Its income grew, both from donations and the tightening of a mandatory tax for all tithing. The Bishop of Rome also relied on this tithe, but this was within the norm. What was definitely not normal was the practice of simony, where the church sold its ranks and sacraments for money. Simony was strictly condemned. In the 6th century, one pope even declared the exchange of money for church positions a heresy. How dare you trade the Holy Spirit? But in practice, the sale of positions never stopped. And then, imagine this. Someone sold the title of the Roman Pope itself. That someone was Benedict IX, the epitome of greed. His father invested a fortune to ensure his beloved son became the next pope. He paid for new church positions so quickly that, to put it mildly, he rushed things. We don't know exactly how old Benedict was when his father bought him the papal title, but it's known he was between 12 and 20 years old. Benedict IX used the position of head of the church to turn temples into brothels. He was constantly drinking and gambling. The Pope loved a luxurious lifestyle and didn't worry about money. Yet he somehow managed not to neglect church affairs. Benedict actively fought heretics and resolved conflicts within the clergy. Perhaps that's why he wasn't immediately overthrown. But things couldn't go on like this for long. The young pope's behavior turned the citizens and minor Roman families against him. Benedict fled Rome, and a representative of a rival family was appointed as the new pope. You'd think that's the end of the story, but no, it's just the beginning. The following year, Benedict regained power, and peacefully at that. But by then, he understood that no one would let him live in peace. He needed to cash out his position as quickly as possible and go enjoy life. So he embarked on an adventure no one else in history dared to attempt. He decided to sell what had been bought for him, the title of the Roman Pope. And a buyer was quickly found, a rather respected bishop named Giovanni Graziano. That marked the end of the 2nd chapter of his papacy. Do you think Benedict settled down after that? Of course not. Soon after the deal, our hero regretted his decision and realized he didn't have enough money to live. What to do? He had to latch back onto the papal trough. So he tried to reclaim power. And, by a stroke of luck, the previous pope happened to die from sugar laced with lead, probably just a coincidence. Thus, Benedict returned to the papal throne for the 3rd time. Yes, the 3rd. No one before or after dared to do such a thing. All these maneuvers infuriated the German emperor. He marched to Rome with his army to restore order. This time, Benedict couldn't manage to sell his title. He was condemned. The accusations were numerous: participation in orgies, rape, and, finally, the sin of selling church authority. For this, he was excommunicated. Order was restored. Benedict went down in history as one of the worst popes ever. No one had ever thought to stoop so low as to trade the title of pope out of sheer greed. This story shook the entire Christian world. To prevent such events, a council of clergy was held. Simony was banned under the threat of excommunication. Did it help? Of course not. There would be many, many more such cases. But this didn't stop the church. not just Christian anymore, but Catholic, from entering a period of its greatest power. The next few centuries would be very successful for the institution of the papacy. Over time, the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, so despised by the Roman popes, would weaken. In 1077, an emperor would beg a pope to lift his excommunication. This happened in winter at the papal residence in Canossa. The Italian philosopher and politician Benedetto Croce called Canossa the first tangible victory of a pope since the fall of the Roman Empire. More triumphs would follow. The pope managed to defend his right to appoint bishops. Emperors resisted for a long time, but eventually gave in. In Italy, throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, a fierce struggle unfolded between two political factions, the pro-papal and pro-imperial forces, known as the Guelphs and Ghibellines. In the end, the Guelphs proved stronger, and emperors didn't dare set foot in Italy for 50 years. It seemed the papacy could do anything to make secular rulers dance to its tune. They didn't have a massive army, but they had the people's authority and the ability to excommunicate any inconvenient politician. The legitimacy of monarchs at that time was sacred, divine, meaning excommunication stripped them of their right to rule. It was during this time that the two swords theory we mentioned earlier began to be interpreted as follows. Both swords belonged to the Pope. The sword of secular power was granted to secular rulers only out of the Pope's goodwill. But everything has an end. In the late Middle Ages, the rules of the game changed. Rulers across Europe began consolidating power in their hands. Feudalism was on its way out, but the popes chose to simply ignore this. It would cost them dearly. In 1294, a rare event occurred. Pope Celestine V abdicated his position. His place was taken by Pope Boniface VIII. Interestingly, it was Boniface who persuaded his predecessor to step down. Celestine was deeply troubled, believing himself a poor vicar of God on earth. However, once Boniface gained power, his first decision was to imprison his predecessor, who soon died. Boniface was a proud man and used the two swords theory to its fullest. He believed the papacy was not only spiritual, but also secular authority. Nothing was to happen without his knowledge or will. Because of disagreements with him, many thinkers of the time were sent into exile. One of them was Dante Alighieri, who, in his Divine Comedy, placed Boniface in the 8th circle of hell for the simony we're already familiar with. Boniface felt that everything he touched turned to gold, and he tried to go even further. In 1302, the Pope officially endorsed the two swords theory. Essentially, this was a direct declaration that kings were his vassals, and the Pope answered only to God. This didn't sit well with any secular rulers, but it particularly enraged King Philip the Fair of France, not to be confused with Philip the Fair from the video about the Habsburgs. That's a few centuries later. Philip, for the first time, convened a French equivalent of a parliament, the Estates General, where he accused the Pope of heresy. Though he had no right to do so, he had enough authority and brute force to back it up. Boniface retaliated by excommunicating Philip and nullifying all oaths of vassal loyalty to the monarch. Then an unprecedented event occurred. Philip's authority outweighed that of the church. The king's vassals remained loyal to him, the clergy obeyed him, and the townspeople loved him. The old methods of coercion by the Pope proved useless. It was time to pay the price. In 1303, Philip sent a detachment of soldiers to take the Pope captive. According to legend, when the detachment's commander met Boniface and suggested a simple solution, abdication, the proud Pope declared he would rather die. The commander then struck the Supreme Pontiff across the face with a heavy gauntlet. The blow didn't kill Boniface, but it shattered the papacy's authority. The Roman Pope was taken prisoner and conveniently died on the way. Most likely, he wasn't tortured. Scholars found no signs of violence on his remains. Boniface was too proud, wanting to become the Pope of a new world where the Church would be stronger than secular power, but his pride led to his downfall, and he lost. After him, the papacy would never again aspire to the heights Boniface dreamed of. And indeed, after his death, he was condemned and officially accused of heresy. But what's worse, after Boniface, the popes were forced to leave Rome. They became hostages of French monarchs for the next 75 years. Like refugees, they were settled in the French city of Avignon, and the subsequent period of church history became known as the Avignon captivity. When the popes finally decided to return to Rome, they would pay a steep price. The entire Catholic world would be plunged into a schism, and the symbol of this would be a pirate pope. In the late 14th century, the Catholic world was shaken like never before. The last captive pope returned from Avignon to Rome, but died shortly after. The Roman crowd, unwilling to be left without their pontiff again, issued an ultimatum to the cardinals. Either they elect an Italian by birth as the new pope, or they would be killed. On the other hand, the French were pressuring the conclave. They weren't ready to let the papacy slip from their grasp so easily. They demanded a Frenchman on the papal throne. The conclave tried to find a compromise. They elected a Neapolitan, Urban VI. Naples was an Italian city, but at the time, it was under the control of a French dynasty. This compromise satisfied no one. Then, in Avignon, a new pope was proclaimed, Frenchman Clement VII. Essentially, a dual papacy regime began. Those like Clement were called antipopes, meaning popes who existed alongside the legitimate one. There were many antipopes in the history of Western Christianity, but Clement was clearly a cut above the rest. He had his own cardinals, dioceses, and even armies. But more importantly, he had monarchies. Let's see who supported whom. France, Naples, Aragon, Castile, and Scotland backed the Avignon Pope. England, Poland, Hungary, and the Scandinavian monarchs supported the Roman Pope. Germany and Portugal wavered. Now tell me, if this isn't a true schism, what is? It was called exactly that, the Great Western Schism. Unsurprisingly, in such times, extraordinary figures rise to the top. One such figure was the Neapolitan nobleman Baldassare Casa. He wasn't a typical golden boy raised to the papal throne. He spent much of his childhood on the island of Ischia in the Bay of Naples. Today, it's a resort, but back then, it was a genuine pirate base. Baldassare's older brother was a real pirate, even called an admiral. At 13, Baldassare began working with him, and by 16, he had gained fame as a daring thug and bandit. It seemed he would spend his life in piracy, but at 20, Baldassare decided to get serious. The Neapolitan pirate enrolled, brace yourself, in the prestigious University of Bologna, studying civil and canon law, essentially aiming to become a lawyer. However, he didn't forget his love for banditry. With his friends, he formed a gang called the 10 Devils. They engaged in robbery and racketeering throughout Bologna. It already sounds like an adventure novel. Let's add more details. In Bologna, he fell in love with a 22-year-old woman. The problem was, she was being hunted by the Inquisition, accused of witchcraft, devil worship, and even incest. When the Inquisitors cornered her, Baldassare and his gang tried to rescue her but failed. He ended up behind bars himself. But even there, our hero didn't lose his nerve. Baldassare killed a guard, escaped prison, and, with his brother's gang, stormed the prison, massacred the guards, and freed his beloved. After that, he went back to sailing the seas. By the way, the main commodity of the ruthless Baldassare was slaves. During one raid, his ship was caught in a storm. The entire crew perished, and Baldassare was washed ashore. There, he was captured and imprisoned for the second time. This time, he was bailed out by none other than the Roman Pope. The thing is, Pope Urban, the Neapolitan, needed skilled commanders. In the young, half-educated pirate, he saw just that. More importantly, he needed someone who could kill whoever Urban pointed to without much remorse. On top of that, Baldassare was ordained a priest. Casa proved to be an extremely effective figure. He was like the Pope's counterintelligence. Any traitor risked being stabbed by Baldassare's men or by him personally. He gave full vent to his wrath. But when Pope Urban died, Baldassare didn't go anywhere. The daring thug was useful to the new pope as well, who appointed him a cardinal. After that, Baldassare could participate in the elections of new popes. In 1406, Pope Gregory XII came to power, and Baldassare didn't get along with him. What do people do in such situations? They join another team. Baldassare could have easily switched to the Avignon Pope's service, but he chose a different path, not to join a bad team, but to create one himself. Baldassare Casa convened the Council of Pisa, which decided to depose both supreme pontiffs at the time. Casa himself was proposed as the new pope, but he found it easier to act as a puppeteer behind more suitable candidates. The puppet pope became Alexander V, who was entirely dependent on Casa. Soon, all key military posts in the new papal government were filled by his pirate friends. Thank goodness they weren't made priests hearing confessions. A year later, it was Baldassare Casa's turn to become pope. In 1410, the pirate pope emerged under the name John XXII. That made 3 popes in Europe, alongside those in Rome and Avignon. Religion mattered little to the pirate, only blood and profit. He openly sold indulgences, forgiving sins for money. Still, the new pope had to engage in religious life. Soon, he attended the Council of Constance, which had 2 issues on the agenda, one to do with the Czech heretic Jan Hus and how to overcome the schism. Baldassare was in a precarious position. Among all the popes, he was the least legitimate. So he played smarter. Before the council, he struck a secret deal with Frederick of Austria, a representative of our beloved Habsburgs. In exchange for protection, Casa handed over the papal army to Frederick's control, along with a pile of money. But things didn't go as planned. The Council of Constance ruled that all popes needed to be deposed and a new one elected. Only the Roman Pope agreed. Casa said, "Hold on a minute," and fled, disguised as a stable hand. Under the Habsburgs' protection, he made demands, renounced the papal title in exchange for retaining the title of the Pope's personal representative in Italy, a pension of 30,000 gold florins, and, for dessert, control over Bologna, Avignon, and a few other cities. To give you an idea of his appetite, 30,000 florins back then was an enormous sum, equivalent to 300 three-story houses. Everyone was stunned by these demands, and the council, with full authority, decided to depose Baldassare. Finding reasons wasn't hard. Out of 70 charges, only 20 were read aloud. The rest were hushed up, lest people wonder how such a monster could have donned papal vestments. Some of the charges included burning monasteries, torturing bishops, raping over 300 nuns, attempting to sell St. John's relics for 50,000 florins, and corrupting an entire family, including the mother and her daughters. It seemed Baldassare Casa faced at least execution by burning. But no, he served a couple of years in prison, then regained the title of bishop and cardinal. Casa died in wealth and comfort in 1419, and his tomb was adorned by none other than Donatello. What an astonishing story! Previous popes at least had respectable origin stories, but not Baldassare Casa. Despite the lenient sentence, for the next 500 years, no pope took the once popular throne named John, as if Casa never existed. The next pope to take the name was, fittingly, John XXII. It seemed things couldn't get worse, but next I'll tell you about a true demon. He embodied all the sins we've discussed. His name was Rodrigo Borgia. On January 1st, 1431, a boy named Rodrigo was born into a Spanish noble family from the de Borja lineage. Becoming a priest was his predetermined path from childhood. His uncle, Alonso, was a cardinal living in Rome. By the early 15th century, the days of Roman papal houses were long gone, but nepotism hadn't disappeared. The papacy had become far more global, with families from Spain, France, and various Italian regions. Young Rodrigo entered such a papal court. He absorbed a simple truth: everything around him was not about holiness, but about power. In 1455, his uncle de Borja became the new Bishop of Rome under the name Calixtus III. He quickly pulled Rodrigo up the ranks. Here, Rodrigo proved himself an excellent secular administrator. He was a true Midas. Every church estate he touched began generating profit. Money flowed into Rodrigo's hands. When his uncle died 3 years later, Rodrigo de Borja, now Borgia, was already independent and self-sufficient. In 1472, he essentially arranged the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. We mentioned them in the video about Habsburg incest. They were related, and only a dispensation delivered by Rodrigo resolved the issue. But at the same time, he revealed his darker side. He kept a good portion of the diocese's income for himself, spending it on a luxurious lifestyle. Beyond that, he had an insatiable attraction to women. It wasn't just that he associated with concubines, Borgia participated in the most scandalous orgies, rumors of which spread throughout Rome. As a result, he fathered 3 children. No, these aren't the Borgias you might be thinking of. The first bastards of the future pope were sent far away so they wouldn't hinder his career. They were merely a burden to him. Only at 37 did he take holy orders. By the rules, he was no longer supposed to have women. Well, he ignored that rule too. Essentially, his wife became a simple girl named Venazia de Catania. Venazia was very similar to Marozia from the 10th century. Before becoming Rodrigo's mistress, she was the concubine of another cardinal and future pope, Julius II. She was accused of poisoning her mother, Elena, who was also linked to Rodrigo through intimate relations. Quite a pair, Kanye West has nothing on them. Rodrigo wasn't shy about his relationship with Venazia. They had 4 children, Giovanni, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. These are the Borgias considered the infamous clan that would later strike fear across Italy. Officially, Rodrigo didn't acknowledge them. That would have been too much for a cardinal and pope in the 15th century. But everyone understood perfectly well without any admissions. 1492, while Columbus explored the Bahamas, Pope Innocent VIII died in Europe. It was time for new elections. Realizing his chances were slim, Borgia began weaving intrigues. His accumulated wealth came in handy. Bribery worked, for mules loaded with silver arrived at the mansion of Cardinal Ascanio Sforza. Thus, Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, became the new Bishop of Rome. Here's a crucial point. Rodrigo decided to use his papal throne to the fullest. He took nepotism to unprecedented heights. Let's see, his sons, 17-year-old Cesare and 18-year-old Giovanni, were appointed Archbishop of Valencia and Supreme Constable of Naples, respectively. He didn't forget to reward his supporting cardinals again. The brother of his new main mistress, Giulia Farnese, was made a cardinal. In total, during his 11-year pontificate, he appointed 45 new cardinals, when there had only been 23 before. Rodrigo turned the papacy into a true business. Old cardinals were deliberately poisoned, their vacant slots sold through simony, and then the new ones were poisoned, an endless money-making machine by Borgia. His daughter Lucrezia became his main weapon. From her mother Venazia, she inherited a love for poisons. Her rings had compartments to discreetly slip poison into a guest's wine when they looked away or got distracted. Such business schemes began to annoy their opponents. The French, hoping to place their own candidate on the papal throne, immediately started a war with the Borgias. These wars would dominate Rodrigo's entire reign. Now, let's talk more about the Borgia children. We'll start with the middle son, Cesare. Philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli considered him the model of a ruler and leader. He commanded the papal armies and repeatedly crushed the armies of the Pope's enemies. But he's trailed by a string of strange events. First, his older brother Giovanni died under mysterious circumstances. Second, he was linked to very strange, intimate relations with his sister Lucrezia. Almost everyone in Rome said they were lovers. This level of incest couldn't easily be swept under the rug with papal dispensations. But the most outrageous event in terms of debauchery was the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts in October 1501. The Apostolic Palace invited the Pope's closest circle, spiritual advisors and nobles. In the hall, they were greeted not only by tables laden with food and wine, but also by dozens of prostitutes. Then a game began. The women crawled across the table, trying to catch chestnuts with their private parts. And the vicar of God on earth watched, laughed, clapped his hands, and thoroughly enjoyed himself. It all ended, of course, in an orgy. It seemed everything was perfect. Cesare and the Pope's allies managed to subjugate much of the country. The Papal States could have united all of central Italy. Even their former enemy, France, became Rodrigo Borgia's ally, unlike his old homeland of Aragon and Castile, which turned against him. 1503 summer. Spanish and French armies stood outside Rome. It was dangerous for the Pope to leave the city, as was customary. So Rodrigo decided to rest within the city. On August 6th, he and his son Cesare attended a feast hosted by a trusted cardinal. But immediately after, all the guests felt ill. Cesare survived, but Rodrigo died 12 days later. There are many theories about what happened. A popular hypothesis is that Rodrigo tried to poison his son Cesare with a poisoned apple, like Snow White, but got confused and poisoned himself. Some wrote that Rodrigo and his son tried to poison everyone at the feast with water, but drank it themselves. But I prefer another version by historians. The cause of death could have been malaria combined with an intestinal infection. The thing is, people left Rome in the summer for a reason, to escape the mosquito-infested swamps around the city. This time, it didn't work and malaria claimed the Roman Pope. Essentially, this was the end of the Borgia family's claim to papal power. Lucrezia and the younger son Geoffrey stayed out of politics, while Cesare tried to fight for his fortune. After his father's death, he looted the most valuable items from the famous Castel Sant'Angelo. In the end, Cesare ended up in Spanish captivity, fell out with the French, and died in battle with a minor Basque count. The Borgia family had no more hopes for a grand future. Pope Alexander VI was hardly remembered by his papal name. To everyone, he remained the cunning, cruel, debauched, and greedy Rodrigo Borgia. The Borgias became a brand, true demons in human form. Much of what I've told you is what people thought about them, but not all of it was true. What matters is that they became the ultimate sinners in the eyes of their contemporaries. As for what really happened, there's no one left to ask. Rodrigo's actions on the papal throne led to 3 major consequences. The first is obvious to everyone. The Reformation, a strong opposition to all of Catholicism. Essentially, Rodrigo showed how low the papacy had fallen. He was seen as absolute evil, and the fact that such a man could wear papal vestments raised many obvious questions. The second, lesser-known consequence, Borgia provided timely support to Spain's colonial empire. It was under him that the division of the New World began, and he essentially acted as the arbiter in this division. By treaty, all lands west of the so-called Papal Meridian, roughly 49 degrees west longitude, were recognized as Spanish possessions, while those to the east belonged to Portugal. So, the next time you look at a map and wonder, why is Brazil the only Portuguese-speaking country in the Western Hemisphere? Here's the simple answer: it was the only one east of that line. But what's far more important is that the Church itself began to change. The true moral nihilism of the papacy was broken by Pope Paul IV. Coming to power in 1555, this elderly inquisitor began restoring order with an iron fist. He spared no one, but ultimately instilled Christian morality in all his successors. After him, there were no cases of a pope being so blatantly sinful. In conclusion, I'd like to say this. The history of many societies and religious institutions has dark pages, but they shouldn't be swept under the rug. On the contrary, we need to talk about them and reflect on them so that this inoculation can work in the future. The Catholic Church, even in the last 100 years, has faced horrific scandals. For example, according to estimates by the French Catholic Church, since 1950, over 3,000 pedophile priests have been part of its ranks. The issue of sexualized violence against children has become a constant companion of news about the Catholic Church in recent decades. Such horrors from the past can't be undone, and broken lives can't be pieced back together. So, the Church can only regret, apologize, draw conclusions, and change as it has already managed to do with the selection of Roman popes. If you found this interesting, give this text a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends who are fascinated by everything related to the Vatican and Dan Brown.